What's up, guys? We're here with a brand new video with History Teacher Reacts. In particular, we're going to be going and starting our series on World War II. I'm sure a topic many of y'all are interested, like myself. And this particular video is quite complex in the sense of the scale of it, but essentially it's asking the question, why the Nazis lost World War II? Now, this YouTube channel goes by the name of Trigonometry, right? Like a trigger. Pretty cool. And they have a guest appearance from the historian James Holland. If you've ever watched maybe the OG History Channel before Netflix, although he does come out in Netflix documentaries, I'm sure, he's authored several books. If you've ever watched or been around World War II history, you have seen this gentleman, James Holland, and he's a great personality, and he is about to lay it all on the table for us. And we can go ahead and give our own analysis. Let's jump into it.
Britain stands alone. France has fallen. Most of mainland Europe has fallen. The Channel Islands, the Nazis are there. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, we're in the shit. How did we manage to get out of this situation?
Well, we get out of it because Germany's not as good as they seem at the beginning of the war with the Blitzkrieg years, because it does have this. Germany does have this shortage of supplies and access to the world's oceans, and because Britain is a nation, is an island nation with the world's largest navy and the world's largest merchant fleet and access to over 80% of the world's merchant shipping, and those are.
What he's referring to is that the Germans were not, Nazi Germany was not ready or prepared for these large-scale invasions. I mean, they were able to get away with Poland and Norway and Denmark, but when it comes to, and obviously they conquered France, no doubt about it, but as you start really getting these longer wars and you start getting that attrition period, they don't have the industrial backing, they don't have the resources, they are heavily reliant on trade and British rules the waves. Right at this time,
incalculable advantages. And also in the summer of 1940 it has the world's first fully coordinated and only air defense system. So in the past, what's happened,
James Holland here is referring to the fact that the British Empire had access to the first radar technology, so they're able to detect things as they come across that English Channel, and they're able to deter the Luftwaffe, the air force of Nazi Germany.
the Luftwaffe has been able to choose when it comes over and destroys people's airfields and aircraft on the ground, because its enemies don't know when they're coming. But now we do. Britain does know when it's coming, it can see, and it can prepare for it. So A, it can take off and make sure its aircraft aren't on the airfield when the Germans come a-calling. And secondly, they can attack them and they can manipulate them and they can control them from the ground so that they're best placed to attack the Germans. And you know, it's often said that the Battle of Britain is closer on Finland. It's absolutely no such thing. You know, the Germans are absolutely annihilated. Well, they're not annihilated, but they're very, very badly beaten. You know, in the whole of the Battle of Britain, they destroy, put out of action 1 out of 138 airfields for more than 48 hours.
Wow.
You know, that is not a good effort, you know, when they're used to just coming over and just destroying everything in sight. So,
and the Luftwaffe never really recovers from this period. It's a very large miscalculation on the part of the Luftwaffe, right? It's just bad call.
So they don't get very far, and they don't even destroy the RAF, not even close. Their intelligence is terrible. The tactics are appalling. They switch to bombing London, which is catastrophic and horrendous. And the Blitz is the first time ever that cities of one country have a sustained aerial bombardment. I mean, it's never.
The Blitz, what he's referring to, there's a great documentary on Netflix if you want to check it out. The Blitz is where the Luftwaffe switches from military strategic targets, airfields, air bases, military bases, infrastructure, whatever the case may be, to purposely targeting civilians, in particular London. The reason they're doing this is because they want, in their head, right, they want to crush the morale of the English citizens to potentially push the English government to go to the table and peace out, right? Like, you know, stop the war. But when you have a personality like Churchill as your prime minister, and you just have the relentless spirit of the English people at this time, it just doesn't phase them, right? So, I mean, obviously it phases them, but man, they are a brave group of people that faced that aerial bombardment for many, many months.
Never happened before. You know, Rotterdam's been hit, Warsaw's been hit, but not in a sustained way that lasts 7 months. So this is all kind of, you know, new turf. But Britain shows that it can take it. But my point is, they haven't even got to the Navy. You know, they haven't even put a ship in the water yet. And you know, you've got to transfer an army to do an invasion. Well, they haven't got landing craft. There aren't any landing craft. Landing craft haven't been invented at that point. There's no Higgins boat or landing ship or anything. So how are they going to do this? Well, they're doing it in river barges, which they've taken from the Rhine, which is absolutely scuppering their internal trade and industry because they've got no means of movement. And they haven't got enough motorised barges anyway. So the idea is one motorised barge tows the other two. I mean, can you imagine? How's that going to work when you actually hit the beach? I mean, this is absolutely bonkers.
I'm not huge on hypotheticals or alternate histories. I always tell my students that because they'll ask me like, what if this? And I love that they're curious, but my favorite college lecturer, Sarah Payne, says it best whenever she gets hypotheticals. I don't know, which is awesome because as an educator, as somebody that's in higher, like her, that's in higher education, we don't know. It's okay to not know. I think that builds a lot of credibility. So I don't know. We don't know what would happen if, you know, Operation Sea Lion, which was Germany's proposed plan to invade the British Isles, how it could have happened. Short answer, it couldn't have. But in theory, if they wanted to do something like that, they would have they should have never invaded Russia, right? I'm sorry, the USSR. Operation Barbarossa should have never happened. And they would have had to have had either an armistice or a ceasefire or a peace deal and build up their Navy, the Kriegsmarine, because what they had, the surface level ships in comparison to the British Navy was far superior, and they just didn't have landing craft. You can't get on a beach on barges, not when there's machine gun fire coming at you.
And even if they had got there, then you know they'd have been absolutely hammered by millions of people in uniform, firing at them. So Operation Sea Lion, which is the proposed invasion of Britain, has no chance, and it's not going to happen, and it doesn't happen. It's very, very difficult to do an amphibious invasion when you haven't had years of preparation for it. What that does do is it gives Britain the understanding that any future once it's isolated, any future offensive operations are going to have to be amphibious by their very nature. So it does start creating landing craft, and so does the United States at the same time. At the same time that France is surrendering and Britain is kind of taking its navy back from its army back from Dunkirk in late May, early June 1940, Roosevelt is going, I need to do this amazing political volte-face. I need to.
Dunkirk is a huge miscalculation on. Well, initially the Allies for getting themselves in that situation, but the Wehrmacht for not pressing the envelope and really doing something with that pocket there at Dunkirk. It's that was an interesting one for sure. Hitler orders a stop of his tanks, and they don't really know why.
Massively rearm, even though I got into power in the election of 1932 on an isolationist ticket. And anti-militarism, we now need to change all that. And we don't have the time or space to go into how he does that, but he does that very, very effectively, so that by the time that America comes into the war in December 1941, actively, it has become the arsenal of democracy. But it goes from kind of, nothing to this, to the huge
in the matter of a couple of years.
Armed forces and huge sort of armaments factories that develops in very, very quick order. It's an astonishing turnaround. But Britain is doing exactly the same. I mean,
I'm assuming he's gonna end up talking here about production, but I like to think of, again, the very service level. Let me unpause him. Poor guy. I like to think of, at least on the Western Front, we can deep dive. I'm sorry, the Western and Eastern Front in terms of Europe. We can deep dive into Asia and Japan in particular in some other video. But I like to think of it as the war was won with Soviet manpower. 20 million plus Soviets died in World War II. For comparison, America has about 400,000 casualties between civilians and military personnel. Vast disparity there. British Navy, British technology in the form of radar, and British espionage, huge. The lives and livelihood, right? The lives and livelihood of French citizens, because they're occupied for quite a long time. And then the industrial might of the Americans and the technological advances that come out of that time period. I mean, you look at the atomic bomb, you look at anti-submarine technology with the Hedgehogs and sonar, long-range bombers. I mean, those are the main points I can think of as to why the Nazis end up losing this war. And they bit far too much, too much dip on their chip, which is obviously a good thing for any democracy, peace-loving individual.
32,500 aircraft in the Second World War. Germany produces maybe 80,000. United States creates something like over 315,000 aircraft in the Second World War.
Right,
83,000 aircraft in 1943 alone. I mean, these are astronomical figures. 83,000 aircraft is 1,000 more than the capacity of Twickenham Stadium, for example.
Have you ever wanted to see your home from space?
Little
With
ad
this free
action,
satellite Earth Maps
free
tool,
PR.
you
I'm
can
gonna
zoom
skip that
right
though. Sorry, buddy.
Wow.
Imagine what that looks like in terms of actual aircraft. I mean, it is absolutely incredible. But in 1939,
Production was
September
huge this time.
1939, the
Industrial
USA
might.
has the 19th largest army in the world of about 188,000, which is tiny by 1930 standards.
Very small.
Sandwiched between Portugal and Uruguay. So, to go from that to kind of 6.5 million people in uniform by 1945 is going some. And what the United States realized and what Britain realized is that mass will win. That if you don't lose in the initial strike, Germany simply doesn't have the resources to win. And I would say, on balance, Britain and America, and Britain to start off with, fight a very pragmatic war. They use the resources to the best of their ability. Britain very early on realizes that the Battle of the Atlantic is the battleground which is going to be the most important in the entire war, and it is.
For sure.
Because through the Atlantic, all the shipping
World's trade
passes, whether it's going supplies to the Soviet Union, Arctic convoys and all the rest of it,
Lend-Lease.
or to Middle East, or to Europe, or obviously supplying Britain. So
What he's referring to is shipping and supplying of the Allies. The Allies, one thing they had in their favor, amongst other things, obviously, is that they coordinated really well. They share technology, at least America and Britain, and they were willing to help each other out. In the United States case, in the form of Lend-Lease. That was their way of the United States' way to get it involved in the war, albeit indirectly, without a formal declaration of war. Now, declaration of war comes when Pearl Harbor happens, but the United States is, keeping their hand on the scale, supplying Britain with food, armaments, supply, and even the Soviets. So that shipping was a big deal, and the Nazis recognized that, which is why the U-boats, Wolf Tactics comes out, commerce rating, convoy rating, you name it, which could be a whole video on itself. And I find that extremely fascinating. So maybe the next video, who knows?
The Atlantic is absolutely crucial. That is where the bulk of Britain's research and development goes into. By May 1941, so comparatively early in the war, Britain gets to a point where it is not going to lose the Battle of the Atlantic. Doesn't mean to say it's won it by that point. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic comes in May 1943, so 2 years later. But it's got to the point where it's not going to lose. And I would argue that by the end of 1941, Nazi Germany is already finished, which is obviously a lot earlier than most people would think. But just think about this. So in the middle of June 1941, Nazi Germany has one enemy, albeit Britain. It's Britain plus Dominion and Empire, but it only has one enemy. Fast forward 6 months.
I do want to note the Dominion and Empire, what he's referring to are places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, British Malaya, these colonies or these dominions that eventually win their independence, thankfully, because it's part of democracy, they play a very, very crucial role. And I want to note India in particular because I read something recently talking about how at the beginning of the war they had about 200,000 volunteers, and by the end of it they had around 2 million Indian personnel fighting against tyranny, fascism, and the Nazis, which is huge when you take into account the fact that India was not free yet. They were still very much under subjugation, and they hadn't entirely won their independence, which I think speaks volumes of, the Indian people.
To the middle of December 1941, has three enemies. Has the United States of America, has the USSR, and it has Great Britain plus Empire. It's not going to win.
And it's lost the Battle of Moscow, which was crucial as well, right by that point. Well, that was massive. I think that it's the first time they really lost a lot of men. And their momentum was stopped. They didn't capture Moscow.
Well, the truth is Operation Barbarossa, which is the German battle
Unrealistic.
plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union, is terrible. It's a really bad plan. It's completely undercooked. They don't have remotely enough to do what they're trying to do. They're attacking on three giant thrusts over
The Soviet Union
vast
is
space. They simply
huge,
do not
largest,
have the
or now the
mechanization,
Soviet Union
the
is
oil,
now Russia. It's the largest
infrastructure
country in the
to
world,
carry it out.
landmass-wise.
The only reason they have the success they do is because the Red Army is even worse. And this is because of the huge purges that have taken place in the 1930s, where 22,500 Red Army officers have been executed or imprisoned, including 3.
What he's referring to here is the purges that Stalin oversaw. You have to take in consideration that Stalin is a product of the Russian Revolution that overthrew the Tsarist government, the monarchy. So that sentiment, I can't speak for the man. That sentiment, in my opinion, probably always stuck with him, right? That sense of paranoia, right? Being paranoid. So in the initial years, he purged quite a few people in his military high command, which obviously trickles down to the inefficiency that his military faced in the early wars of that. Of the early years of that war.
3 out of 5 marshals and I think 15 army commanders. I mean, they are terrible. And actually, the Red Army continues to be very, very badly led throughout the Second World War. They've always been incredibly expensive in manpower, and nothing's changed in the Second World War. Any Soviet, any Russian leaders won't like me for saying this, but the encirclement of Stalingrad, the encirclement of the German Sixth Army, which is such a kind of, an important moment in the Second World War. While it's not Germany's biggest defeat, it is is unquestionably a big turning point. Mm-hmm. That only happens thanks to 75,000, United States vehicles that
talking about coordination. That's a Lend-Lease right there.
Operation Uranus. So you can't do the encirclement unless you can move fast. The only reason you can move fast is with all that mechanization. Where's the mechanization come from? It comes from the United. It comes from Lend-Lease. So there's absolutely no question that while more blood is spilled on the Eastern Front, that is absolutely irrefutable. There's no question about it.
The vast majority of deaths are in the Eastern Front,
in terms of civilian deaths rather than military deaths. Is absolutely horrific, and military deaths is also horrific. Military deaths are really, to a large extent, result of military inefficiency. Just take this for example. Final Battle of Berlin, which is launched on the 16th of April 1945. They're coming up against 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 60-year-olds. Volkssturm, basic home guard. Yes, a handful of veterans and Waffen SS types and all the rest of it, but a massively, horrifically depleted German armed forces.
He's referring to those last few months of World War II, where East and West meet to converge on Berlin, the headquarters of Nazi Germany, the capital. Now he's talking about how the Volkssturm is a militia home guard that the Nazis, through propaganda, created, and they're basically scraping the barrel, But I just want to know, could you imagine, those men maybe in their 50s and 60s that potentially could have fought in both world wars, being forced to the front? Man, Nazi Germany, terrible what they did, but you got to feel, you know, a little sympathy or empathy for a lot of those innocent Germans. But, you know, you got to take care of your government, man. You got to make sure the right people are in power.
Which shouldn't be able to put up much of a shot against anyone. Against them, they've got thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, something like 41,000 artillery pieces, you know, millions of men. And yet, in little over 2 weeks, they managed to lose over 900,000 casualties. That doesn't strike me as an army that's really knows what it's doing very
Efficient.
much. And the reason they're all being killed is because their commanders are incredibly reckless with the lives of their men, and they're very undertrained. So they're just using mass and bulk to overwhelm the enemy, but that comes at a huge cost. Whereas the Western allies are very conservative with men's lives, and yes, they're a bit more cautious, and yes, that means they might take a little bit longer to do something. But the bottom line is what they're using steel, not our flesh, to do a lot of the hard yards. In other words, they're using their global reach, they're using industrialization, mechanization, modern technology to do a lot of the hard yards so that the number of men in the firing line is kept to an absolute minimum. This is why only, you know, of Allied armies, American, Canadian, British armies operating in the European theatre of operations, for example, only around 14% are infantry, only 8% are in tanks, of which that 8% in a tank unit, only about 48% are actually in tanks. The rest are support troops supporting those tanks. 22% are artillery, 43% are service corps. And what that tells you is that this is a very, very heavily material-based, heavily industrial-backed armed forces, which is all the more efficient and effective as a result of that.
A lot can be said about logistics, about planning, about industrial power, about technological power on the Allies. All right, guys, I'm not going to dive too deep. Like I said in my last video, I could talk about this all day. If you're even remotely interested in stuff like this, please go ahead and drop a like and a subscription so we can come back and continue this series on World War II. You know, I'm thinking U-boats maybe next. Touch a little bit on that Pacific campaign and, you know, just get the ball rolling from there, guys. I'm extremely appreciative that you took the time out of your day to go ahead and watch this video. Shout out to Trigonometry and James Holland. I'm excited, guys. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for stopping by. God bless y'all.